Thank you again, everyone, for your amazing presentations. We'll go ahead and begin with the Q&A. First question we have is for Dr. Harris. Do any of the Kabuki syndrome babies experience anxiety and mood disorders?
The babies?
Yes, it says babies.
I quite possibly. We don't really have good ways to test whether or not a baby has anxiety or mood disorder, but we sometimes could see the ways that you would look for that would be, potentially a baby would be really fussy or irritable, but that could be difficult in our kiddos with Kabuki syndrome because many of the babies are having significant feeding and GI issues, which by themselves creates quite a bit of irritability and things like that. So I would say it would be very, very hard to suss out what was anxiety or mood disorder from in a baby from, feeding issues or other things. We do know that uh, people with Kabuki syndrome develop anxiety as a specific feature of the syndrome that gets worse as individuals get older. But that's, I think, the best I could answer as far as babies.
Thank you so much. We'll go to the other end of the spectrum about individuals who are adults and older. Is it ever too late to try to improve intellectual ability? We have a particular participant whose child is 19 and in the middle of their first year of college and having difficulty in math. And so I guess the question is it ever too late to improve intellectual ability? I can direct this to both Hans and Dr. Harris and Dr. Bjornsson.
So in our mouse studies, we've tested both very young pups, which would be like young adults, but or maybe 1 month old mice. But we've also done studies in older mice, like 5 months, which is a completely adult mouse. So and the effect was promising in both ages, but it was more promising in the younger than the older. And I think there may be for some other genetic diseases, we've seen that the window of opportunity can extend, but sometimes the earlier you start, probably you're going to get a bigger impact. So.
Thank you.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, the data I presented on the Atkins diet, those were all adults. So the fact that there was some cognitive improvement does indicate that yes, they can that it is possible. And 19 is still a very young adult, so there would be definitely some potential window there. I would say that if you're talking about someone, into their 40s, 50s, and 60s, right, then we know that even in individuals without Kabuki syndrome, that unfortunately at that point in time, cognition starts to go the other way. So that would probably become a very difficult age range to be able to measure actual improvement. And then the other thing that I will say is that most individuals with Kabuki syndrome struggle mightily in math. So that scenario doesn't surprise me. That's pretty specific to what we see in Kabuki syndrome. And I would encourage your child's college, you and your child and their college to think broadly about, how we can work around that, because math is going to be an issue.
Thank you. The next question is, can you explain what BHB is and how long will it take to determine the dosage? We'll direct that to Dr. Harris and maybe Dr. Tang, if you want to also support that answer with the dosage question.
Yeah, I could just say what BHB is, and then Dr. Tang could talk more about the dosage finding study. So BHB is something that is produced by the liver when the body is in ketosis. And there could be a number of ways that the body is in ketosis, but in this case, we're usually talking about putting the body in ketosis by not giving it enough glucose or sugar, which is its normal fuel. And so the liver then breaks down other things to make other types of fuel, and BHB is one of those things that is created. And so we think that BHB has a specific effect at the places where it's relevant for Kabuki syndrome, in the body and the brain. And that's why that's something that we are looking at increasing the levels of, whether that be through a dietary therapy or giving it exogenously.
And in terms of how long we think the dosage study will take with the BHB, we're thinking about a year. It takes some time, and we're still establishing the mouse colony at the CRO for the mouse to breed up to a sufficiently large cohort to conduct these behavioral studies. And then we will need to dose and do the experiments and then analyze the data. So hopefully by the end of 2025, we'll have some data to share with you all.
I just wanted to comment, one other thing that's amazing about BHB and the ketones is that they're actively transported into the brain. So it kind of solves one of the delivery problems if this works. So that's one of the reasons. And in our mouse studies, we didn't dose very often. So it seemed to be that even just opening that window a little bit could have a benefit in the brain. But, it's one study. It's nice to validate and get more detailed data.
There's a lot of questions on the diet, and one of them is if there's been any studies that determine whether or not the keto diet is helpful for children who have KDM6A or individuals with KDM6A.
We haven't done it in humans, but based on how how it works, we would hypothesize that it could also be useful for individuals with KDM6A as well as KMT2D. That's one of the attractiveness of this particular therapy, is that it is potentially applicable to both types.
We understand that the clinical trial was with adults, and there is a question about applying the modified Atkins diets to kids and teens, and whether you'd think we could apply that same diet to that age group.
Yes, that's the plan. That's the big study we want to do, would be in kids and teens. That's exactly the group that we want to go to next. It's gonna, babies are a little bit of a different thing. They're kind of probably the next step, but kids and teens are the direct next step.
Great, thank you. There is a question, Dr. Bjornsson, I'll direct this to you. Could any potential therapies help with hearing loss?
Well, again, we don't know the window, but it's quite possible. I think, we see in the strain studies that the hearing is much better in some of the other strains. So our hope is to kind of map that interacting gene, and that might give us an insight into the mechanism. Kabuki syndrome hearing loss is interesting because a lot of the hearing loss in other disorders happens very early. But what we see, and Jackie and I have published on this with Allison, is that the hearing loss kind of occurs over time. So there may be some environmental exposure or something, but by having a stronger tractable kind of mechanism, it might be easier to try to avoid that. So I'm optimistic about that.
Thank you. Returning to a diet question, if the goal is to put the body in ketosis, how would this impact a child with hyperinsulinism?
Yeah, so it's a good question. Actually, it's one of the things that we have to look at, but actually sometimes ketogenic diet can be used as an actual thing for hyperinsulinism when things aren't working well. But these are factors that would have to be considered as far as safety, but hyperinsulinism wouldn't be necessarily a total contraindication to doing the diet is the general answer, but with nuances that individual situations would have to be considered.
Thank you. Again, another diet question. This is specifically for Dr. Harris. Are the methylation changes from the modified Atkins diet stable? Do the methylation changes revert if the diet changes? You also mentioned that there were no negative side effects, but does that include any long-term potential side effects like cholesterol or heart health issues?
All really good questions. So the answer to the methylation signature thing is we have no idea, right? So that is something that we would have to investigate in a larger trial. We are still kind of parsing out the data with Dr. Wexberg on the original samples, just looking at the before and after. But that would definitely be something we'd have to look at, is the methylation changes long term. So very, very good question. And we have a lot, like I said, we have a lot more to look at with those methylation changes as far as where are they? What things might be specifically impacted with those regions of change, et cetera. And then the second question, remind me what the second part was, Janet, sorry.
Sure. You mentioned no negative side effects, but curious about any long-term implications.
Yes, so great question. No, not that we know of. So the main side effects that we saw were things that we totally expected, like constipation, nausea, some feelings of tiredness at the beginning. And honestly, most of the side effects that we saw were resolved with increased water intake, which is one of the big things on the diet. And we had several patients have a very, very mild bump in some of their lipid panel things, but that was not sustained, and most were very mild. We had nobody who we had to remove from diet because of extreme increases. We did not have anybody develop kidney stones or any of the things. And what I would say is we wouldn't necessarily expect long-term side effects different than in individuals with Kabuki syndrome than you would see in that like the seizure population or tumor population or other people who have done modified Atkins diet for very long periods of time. So those are kind of our best go-to data about what is the long-term implications. All of that said, a modified Atkins diet is not something we would necessarily want patients to be on from birth throughout their entire life, because there are other parts of the diet, parts of nutrition that, are needed and beneficial. And so that's why we're investigating other mechanisms such as exogenous ketones and things to support this data.
Just a follow-up question to Dr. Harris. Was there a benefit in weight? Some of our patients, seem to be at risk of carrying some extra kilos as they get older. Did you see any effect on that measurement?
Great question. 8 of the 10 individuals lost weight. All of the individuals who lost weight considered it to be a benefit, right? There weren't any individuals who started thin and lost too much weight. So that that was good news. And we also, just to tag on to that, Dr. Wexberg's lab did look, because some of our concern was this DNA methylation signature, this very slight DNA methylation signature change just from weight loss. So we looked at some of those papers that had been published on that and compared those signatures and didn't see much of a change. So we're encouraged the DNA methylation signature is likely brain-based and less likely only due to the fact that they lost weight.
A question from someone asking, I guess they're just curious about why you started with the modified Atkins diet instead of a BHB supplement initially.
Because a modified Atkins, well, because we haven't done the dose finding study, so we don't know how exactly to administer BHB in a way that we would think would be effective and would actually test something. Whereas the modified Atkins diet, people could do that from home. We could tell them exactly what to do. We know exactly what measurements to look for, again, from other disease mechanisms. And so it made a lot more sense from a pilot study data to start with that, to see if we could see an effect, because we could be pretty confident we know how to do a modified Atkins diet. And so we know what we're measuring is what we're measuring.
It's interesting. When we did this original study, we shared our mice with a group in Florida to do some of the exogenous ketones, but I don't think that ever led to a publication, which sometimes happens. So there was some activity there, but it just didn't kind of get reported.
Thank you for sharing that, Dr. Bjornsson. I think that's one of the exciting opportunities that we have now, is with this funding, we'll be able to control the timeframes with this study and really push along this potential clinical trial. There is a question, actually two of them, talking about, there's a question from an adult who has Kabuki syndrome asking if it would be beneficial to adapt the diet on their own, or would it be harmful? And I guess more broadly, we're getting questions asked about just the opportunity to access and start a modified Atkins diet for their child if they're not able to participate in the year-long study. So I guess, what are your thoughts? And this is a question directed to both Dr. Harris and Dr. Bjornsson. Can you provide some guidance to individuals who are thinking of trying this diet without the supervision of you all for guidance?
No, please don't. While it was very safe in this setting, this was a regulated clinical trial. So we were checking in with patients at least once, sometimes multiple times in a week. We were looking at diet logs all the time. We were looking at labs, and it's not safe to do this kind of diet without a doctor's supervision for long term. And then the other thing that I will just say to parents, because, I get it, and I'm a parent, right? I totally understand. The data that I shared with you, the pilot data, it is exciting. I'm not going to downplay it, right? But I promise you, if there was something on that data that was so earth-shattering that I thought that if you all went out right now and did a modified Atkins diet for your kids, totally unregulated, that I thought all, life would turn upside down, then I'd say that. But the data isn't there yet. We need much more data to really say, is this actually worth it, right? Are we actually going to see benefits cognitively beyond, the maybe negative behavioral benefits we may see when you're telling your kid they can't have cake and cookies and things like that at the birthday parties. And that's, that's real. So it is nothing that is recommended, not because, I need my publications, but because I just don't know that it's worth it. And I promise as soon as I know that, I will tell you.
I just wanted to say I agree, especially when you have picky eaters, you have to make sure they don't go into some kind of deficit. So you would have to do it with a health professional. So
Thank you so much. We're just about at time. And first of all, I just wanted to thank all of you for your dedication to Kabuki syndrome research. Thank you so much for carving out some time to join us today.